Well, here we are. Another beautiful spring day. The birds in the air. I've got my little spiv hat on. That's right. So I thought I'd wear something extra just to go with the topic. And the topic is very simple. Should everything make a profit? Now, obviously, in your personal relationships, the profit motive, hopefully, is in part and parcel of that relationship. But outside family, personal relationship, it seems that everything else in our society is based on the idea of creating a profit. And the deregulation, privatisation, corporatisation, globalisation revolution that has occurred over the last almost 50 years is based on that principle. Now, in the 19th century and the early 20th century, most relationships between people and the state was based on the idea that the state looked after those who exercise power. It was there to maintain order, to ensure they continued to exercise power and centralise power and wealth. During the 19th and 20th century, the age of revolution, initially in Western Europe and then in the rest of the world, as the colonial subjects threw off their chains, what we saw was the state being forced to take over essential services and to begin looking after the citizens, the people, within a particular geographic area or a sovereign nation state. So the state's purpose changed from maintaining those in power through a monopoly on the use of violence and force, to providing services, especially essential services, and satisfy basic human needs for the population at last. It was revolutions and revolts, reform movements, which caused this about turn in the role of the state. That didn't mean that the state still didn't do what it could to maintain the power of those who exercise power. Today, in many Western states and around the world, it's not a monarch or even a dictator. It can be representative democracy. But ultimately, it's the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication who continue to call the legislative shots. And that's why in a country as rich as Australia, we have grinding poverty, we have increasing inequality, we have major issues regarding people accessing the basic necessities of life. So that's the situation. To a significant degree, this is based on the underlying philosophy, the underlying ideology, which determines the relationships which exist between the individual, the state, local councils, and in Australia, state governments, as well as the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% of Australians who've got enough disposable income to be part of the investment class. So these are the issues that we face. It's all about creating a profit. And you can see what happens when you open up your borders to international investors, that when a particular company doesn't create a profit, investors move from that company within a second, less than a second, to another company. So creating a profit is the essence, the be-all, the end-all of the corporate world. If you don't create a profit, you go bankrupt. And it's very simple. We see what we call a run on shares of particular companies which don't create profits. And now what's happened in the last 50 years is that most of the gains which occurred during the century of revolution, in the latter half of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century, what we saw is all those gains have disappeared. They've disappeared completely. We now find ourselves in a situation where essential services which were created, which were owned publicly, are now owned by corporations, owned by hedge funds. And we see a 25% increase in energy prices as we transfer from a fossil-based economy to a renewable energy-based economy. Now, if those essential services continued to be owned by the public, continued to be public enterprises, what would have occurred if that mechanisms could have been put in place to ensure you didn't have this huge increase in energy prices, and more importantly, you had a mechanism via which workers in the fossil fuel industry could transfer to the renewable energy industry. But because we have to create a profit for a private corporation, this doesn't occur. So this is the situation we find ourselves here in the first quarter of the 21st century. The privatisation, deregulation, corporatisation, globalisation model has worked, but only for a small percentage of the population. It has worked for the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and it has worked for the 8% of Australians who have enough disposable income to use this country's investment-friendly tax laws to become investors. It has worked. But it has not worked for the other 92%. We've seen the privatisation of higher education. What that means is that now people who access higher education, unless it's subsidised by the state, which is very rarely, what we see is that people who graduate from a tertiary institute find themselves paying off that debt, in some cases for decades. In the past, especially after the reformist movement in the 60s and 70s in this country, we saw that public tertiary education was free. And that allowed many people who would never dream of going to university or going to higher education, accessing higher education. Today they can access it, but it means debt. Obviously, if your parents are rich, they pay for it up front. But in the majority of cases, you have a HECS debt. We see what happens when we have a for-profit mentality in the aged care sector. In the past, the majority of aged care sector was in the hands of the not-for-profit sector. When Mr. Howard, a former Conservative Prime Minister, I should say reactionary Prime Minister, wanted to privatise aged care, what he did is he passed legislation through Parliament which removed the ratio of workers to residents. The private sector said we can't make a profit in the aged care sector unless you remove that ratio, because you make a profit in two ways. You either exploit your customers or you exploit your workers. And in the aged care sector today, as we've seen, the private sector has great difficulty in creating significant profits without exploiting their customers and workers. Obviously, if you've got the resources You've got the superannuation, which is again is a regressive tax, because the less you earn, if you're not in the workforce for a variety of reasons, pregnancy, sickness, disability, you have no superannuation. And if you're in a low paid job, when you retire, your superannuation isn't enough to pay for aged care, and you really have to sell your home and use that as a bond. So again, we're seeing essential services which revolve about looking after the elderly or looking after the very young in preschool education, now being fully privatised. And those publicly owned sectors of those industries have now been, to a significant degree, privatised. And what do we see? Increasing costs, retirement living based on your wage. We see the privatisation of Medicare, which was there to provide entry-level health care for everybody. We see those who don't have private health insurance having to battle to obtain care, especially if it's semi-urgent or non-urgent care, and the list goes on and on. Because are there essential services, are there industries, are there services which don't make profits? And that's the issue. Not everything needs to make a profit. We have gone down this path, and housing is another example. Residential property has become an investment vehicle, not a mechanism via which people put a roof over their head. And we see the current housing crisis. Again, all these essential services, which to a significant degree in the past didn't need to make a profit. So that's the essential dilemma. Do essential services need to make a profit in order to be successful? Now, many public assets which were privatised were making profits. These profits went into expanding those public services, and these profits went into ensuring that everybody had access to these essential services. When you have a system where you have to make a profit, that profit is at the expense of the services, of the customers of those services, and the workers who create those services. Now, in any civilised society, the concept of cross-subsidisation is integral to that function. Cross-subsidisation comes through the taxation system. If you have a taxation system which benefits the wealthy and the powerful, which we have in Australia, if you have corporate welfare, which we have in Australia, then there are never enough resources to look after the needs, the essential needs of everybody. Never enough resources for the public education sector, never enough resources for the aged care sector, never enough resources for the early childhood development sector, never enough resources for the residential sector, and the list goes on and on. Because if your taxation system is organised in such a way as to benefit the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, and the 8% who are investors in this country, you will never be able to tackle the essential problems which face all of us. So if we wish to continue on this private investment for private profit highway, we will continue to be bedeviled with the same problems, because there's never enough resources. Resources should be held in common. They should be used for the common good. In Australia, we are exceptionally fortunate in terms of resources we have. Not just agricultural resources, but in terms of the many natural resources that are at our disposal. Unfortunately, these natural resources have been given away for almost nothing to the private sector, which continue to make extraordinary profits while paying minimal taxation. Now, if you're interested in these ideas, if you don't agree with the private investment for private profit model, if you think there should be cross-subsidisation of essential services in this country, I encourage you to look at public interest before corporate interest. This organisation was formed in late 2015, and our primary function is to put the interests of the public before the interests of the few, the corporate sector. Public interest before corporate interests. Just look around you. There is no reason we should have most of the problems which we face today. There is no reason First Nations people should be living in abject poverty. There is no reason that 1 million children live in poverty. There is no reason that 33% of the population live on a subsistence social security system. There's no reason that most people who are working at the end of the day don't have enough money to save. There is no reason for any of this. The reason is that we accept the ideology of private investment for private profit, and we accept that this ideology not only concerns goods and products and services which are surplus to our everyday needs, but we have introduced the same philosophy, the same ideology, the same political system into providing essential services for the citizens of this country. Unless we are willing to radically change the taxation system, unless we are willing to cross-subsidise essential services, unless we are willing to become part and part of a movement to change this once and for all, we will have the same problems occurring week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade.